Dr. Greg Pontone is an associate professor in the departments of psychiatry and neurology at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in Baltimore, Maryland. He's an attending psychiatrist in the Geriatric and Neuropsychiatry Division and is the director of the Johns Hopkins Parkinson's Disease Neuropsychiatry Clinic, which focuses on diagnosing and treating the neuropsychiatric aspects of Parkinson's and related disorders. Thank you so much for being here. Dr. Pontone is going to share his screen and then get going.
Okay.
Let me know if you have any issues and I can always pull it up too.
Okay. Let's see here. Let me get my screen share going. All right, there's my PowerPoint. Okay.
Not seeing it. I'm just seeing me right now.
Okay.
Can you guys see his screen? Anybody?
Now, let's see.
Can't see it.
How about, why is it asking for photos? Hold on here. We'll do Zoom.
Yeah, there.
There.
We see your Zoom screen. We don't see your.
Huh. You don't see my PowerPoint.
No.
Okay.
If you want to just stop the share screen, I can share it and then you can kind of cue me if I'm not sure about when to move forward. Do you want me to share that?
Sure. Yeah, this is weird because my screen.
Let's see if I can get it up. Are you seeing the presentation now?
We're seeing something about trauma, it looks like.
We're seeing your web browser there.
My goodness.
Yeah, like if the screen is sharing the web browser instead of maybe the desktop or PowerPoint.
Yes, it is. I've never had this problem before. Let me, hopefully. What about now?
There we go.
There we
go.
Okay, good. Thank you for saying yes, good. Okay, let me get it into view mode. Okay.
All right, thank you for that.
Great.
Okay, so yeah, today I'd like to talk to you guys about cognition and mood and how to manage them. I guess I'll just cue you to advance the slide.
Okay.
Okay. I want to start with an overview of cognitive impairment in Parkinson's disease, and I want to make a distinction between mild changes and changes that in some people might become more severe and actually interfere with their ability to interact with their daily life. And so when we talk about cognitive impairment in Parkinson's disease, there's the mild version, which is usually only in certain cognitive domains, okay? And I'm gonna give you a list of cognitive domains, but the important part about the mild changes are that they're things you can usually work around. You're probably gonna be aware of them. For instance, you might notice that you're less organized or that you process information slower, but you find ways to work around those problems and you still get things done. So you're still completely functionally independent and you can still problem solve and get the right answer. It just might take a little longer. Now, in some people, those impairments become more severe and there's more of them. So you might not just be having trouble with organization, you might also be having trouble with memory, and those two things together all of a sudden create a problem that you might not independently be able to solve, and you might need a little bit of help. But the good news is not everybody gets to that severe level, and so we're really going to focus mostly on the kind of mild changes that we see and hopefully give you some tips about what you can do to work around them. Next slide. Now here's those cognitive domains that I mentioned, or the component process of what makes up your mental abilities. And people have different divisions for cognitive function, but here are some of the most widely used. So probably the one that's talked about most in Parkinson's disease is what we call executive function. And that's everything a business executive might do. You know, it's your ability to sort of organize, sequence, and plan. And to some extent, along with attention, your ability to multitask or do more than one thing at the same time. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about that because that's one of the first things many people with Parkinson's disease will notice when the disease starts to affect their cognitive abilities. Processing speed is another thing that changes. So most of you are probably familiar with the term bradykinesia. Brady meaning slow and kinesia meaning movement. Well, there's a similar term that we use for slowed thought, and that's bradyphrenia. So Brady being slow, phrenia being thought. And so again, some people will notice that their thinking slows down a little bit. And often this will slow down most in the off medication state. And so again, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a major problem. It just means it might take a little longer to get things done. Attention is another cognitive domain that can be affected. It's the ability to sort of sustain focus on a task or action. So you might find that it's a little more difficult to follow conversations, especially when several people are involved. And so it just really means you have to learn to cut distractions. Memory is most often pretty well preserved in Parkinson's disease. And I'm going to give a specific example of that. If you're really having major memory deficits, that usually suggests that something more than Parkinson's is happening in the brain. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Visual spatial problems can occur. Usually this might give you problems in navigation and finding your way in unfamiliar places. Language is a domain, our ability to communicate and understand speech is usually well preserved in Parkinson's. Again, just like memory, if you see, especially early changes in language, we start to suspect a secondary process. Okay, next slide.
Are you seeing it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this slide is really for people who move on past the mild changes, because this really represents when it's interfering with day-to-day life. And like I said, this won't happen for everyone. But, if memory becomes impaired to the extent that it's causing problems, you might repeat the same comment or ask the same question again and again. And we most often hear about this from, family members or caregivers of people rather than the person themselves, because they might not recognize that they're repeating themselves. The other thing that we'll notice is that there'll be difficulty learning new information. So in new situations, or if you meet new people, you might have trouble recalling their name or what you did with them. You'll still be able to remember things from the past, usually in fairly vivid detail. Usually past learning or distant learning is still intact. Another thing that we'll see, which is a combination of cognitive domains, is difficulty performing familiar tasks. Sometimes this is called apraxia, but it can literally be having trouble using household appliances, things like the remote control or microwave. I mean, for some people like myself, those are kind of tenuous at best now. But as time goes on, if you were using something well before and now you're having more trouble, that could be a hint that something's changing. And probably one of the most common places we see this difficulty is with organizing medications. most people with Parkinson's have to take medication several times per day. And let me be honest with you, that's a challenge for anyone. I mean, it's not natural to take medications 4 and 5 times per day and to organize them in those little bins and then remember to take them on time. So it's already challenging, but when that really becomes overwhelming, that can be a sign that there's been changes. Now, like I said before, trouble with language, both expressing yourself but also understanding others, is pretty rare in Parkinson's. And the other thing that happens is as we age, it's normal to forget names temporarily. So, you have a niece that you see twice per year and you kind of struggle to bring her name to bear. And, you start to wonder, hey, am I losing it? And most of the time, no. And so what I always tell people with any of these cognitive domains, if most of your friends are doing it, if your peer group is having the same problem, it's probably not an issue, because there are some age-related changes to cognition that are completely normal and don't represent a problem. Now, time and place disorientation. This is usually something that's a little more significant. And, if you get lost in a new place and it's your first time there, again, probably nothing to worry about. But if this is a place where you go often, or maybe even your general community, and you find that you're getting turned around, that's certainly something to pay attention to. And then finally, we sort of have this category that we lump under poor judgment. And this one's a little more complex, because it's probably not just one domain. It's this forgetting of appointments, ignoring the risks of activities. We often see this in people who, should be using assistive devices like, canes or walkers, who get up impulsively without them. And so this poor judgment can manifest in many different ways, and it's probably an amalgam of several different domains of cognitive impairment. And then sometimes, frankly, it's not cognitive impairment at all. It's just people being a little bit stubborn. It's hard sometimes to accept that you might need a little help with the walking. And, we always tell people that it's better to swallow your pride than sustain a fall, because falls are game changers. But anyway, these are the most extreme outcomes of cognitive impairment. Most of the time, the cognitive impairment is going to be mild and something that you can work around with a little bit of modification. Next slide, please. So executive dysfunction and slowed mental processing speed. So this is something that I feel is so common in people suffering from Parkinson's disease, that we should really talk about it in a concrete way in terms of how it might affect you and then what you can do about it. And so, having a little more trouble with making a plan, set shifting, which is going from one activity to another, this really shows up in your day-to-day activity when you think, hey, I should have knocked all these things off my list before lunch, and you're still doing them, at 3 p.m. And so this really creates a sort of subtle inflation to your daily tasks, is probably the first way people notice it, but they don't know exactly what to attribute it to. But it is usually one of the earliest detectable cognitive changes in Parkinson's. And so let me give you an example. Next slide. This is actually a study that was done up in Rochester, New York, here not too far from Albany. And my mentor, Laura Marsh, was so fond of this study that she actually gave it a nickname. So I don't know the actual name of the study anymore, because we've used the nickname for so long. She used to call it the Let's Have Tea study. And the reason she called it that is that the study involved, at one point, walking from a mock kitchen to a living room, carrying a tea set on a tray to serve tea. And really what this task was designed to measure was attention and processing speed and how it affected motor movements in Parkinson's. And so let me give you the setup for this study. Basically, they took people with mild to moderate Parkinson's and people who didn't have Parkinson's, and they asked them to do 4 different tasks. And the idea was that as the complexity of the task increased, so as people started to multitask, do more than one thing at a time, they wanted to see how it affected their ability to function optimally. And so the people with Parkinson's and the people without were asked first to just walk from this mock kitchen to this mock living room, and they were timed. And, on average, the people with Parkinson's walked a little bit slower, but there, wasn't a major difference. Now, the second part was what they called dual motor. And this was asking you to walk and carry a tray. And just that added complexity, that little bit of multitasking of carrying the tray, slowed everybody down. But it slowed people with Parkinson's down just a little bit more proportionally than the people without. Then they did a task where it was walking and recalling a list of words from memory. And this is what they called dual cognitive. Okay, so instead of doing two motor movements, you're doing something mental and something physical. And again, both groups, people with Parkinson's and people without, slowed down, but the people with Parkinson's slowed down proportionally just a bit more than the people without. And then finally, they gave the most complex task, which was walking from the mock kitchen, carrying a tray with a tea set on it while recalling a list of words. And again, everybody slowed down significantly, whether you had Parkinson's or you didn't. But again, the Parkinson's group slowed down much more. And so what this tells us really is that as task complexity increases, gait speed and movement slow down. And it tells us that none of us are good multitaskers because everybody slowed down, and the more you're multitasking, the more you slow down. But that people with Parkinson's disease slowed down even more. And so that tells us that to function optimally, we really need to focus on one thing at a time and eliminate distractions. Next slide. So there's this concept of subcortical cognitive impairment, and we compare that to cortical cognitive impairment, because when we start talking about diseases that affect the brain, everybody, I think for the most part, worries and thinks about Alzheimer's. I mean, I know I have a family history of Alzheimer's, and every time I make a mental slip, I wonder, hey, am I going to end up like grandpa? And so, I think a lot of us worry about that. And Parkinson's really is, for the most part, especially early on, a subcortical disease. And so it affects different parts of the mental experience. As we've mentioned, the executive dysfunction, a little more trouble paying attention, so you have to be a little more deliberate, and just a little slower in terms of processing. You can still get the right answer, it just might take a little longer. Whereas people who have Alzheimer's very early on in that disease, they start to have trouble with memory and language and visual spatial relationships. And so if we see that pattern, that cortical pattern, that usually tells us that something more is there. Now, there are some occasions where in very advanced Parkinson's, you can get cortical problems, but that would be in very advanced disease. And so for the most part, a lot of the cognitive changes you see in Parkinson's can be worked around, can be, you can modify the way you do things to continue to go forward and have a high quality of life. And so I think that's an important distinction. And I can tell you that as a doctor who works with people with Parkinson's, that's one of the things I'm paying attention to, is which domains of cognition are affected. And that really tips me off about how aggressive I might have to be in terms of helping people manage this. Next slide. So I want to give an example of the difference between how a brain affected by Parkinson's might have some memory problems versus how the Alzheimer's brain might have memory problems. And I like to use the example of what I call the file cabinet. So if you imagine that your memory is like a file cabinet, and that when you make a memory, it's like putting a file in that cabinet. Okay. And then when you need to use the memory or recall the memory, it's like getting the file back out. Okay. So let's say you have someone suffering from Parkinson's disease and someone who has Alzheimer's disease, and their wives say, hey, in 3 days, it'll be my birthday, and I want a cake for my birthday. And so each of the spouses hands their partner this recipe on how to bake a cake. And they, tell them what kind of frosting they want and everything. And they say, okay, now hold on to this because in 3 days you're going to need to bake it. Well, the poor fellow with Alzheimer's disease, he can't encode new memories. So he walks over to the file cabinet and he takes this 6-page recipe and he throws 2 pages somewhere randomly into the file. Maybe they land in W, who knows? Takes 2 and throws them somewhere else. And then the other 2, fall on the floor. The point is the guy can't encode new memories because he has a primary cortical memory deficit. Now, the person with Parkinson's, he really doesn't have a problem with encoding or memory in main. He walks over to that file. He goes to file C. He puts that 6-page recipe into the cabinet and closes the drawer. Okay. Now, here's the glitch. The problem for both of them comes 3 days later. Their wives show up and say, hey, it's my birthday. I want a cake. Well, the guy with Alzheimer's, he goes over, he opens the drawer, and she's not going to have a good birthday because that memory is never been encoded. So no matter how hard he searches or how many hints she gives him, that memory is not there. Now, the person with Parkinson's goes over to that drawer, he opens it, and the memory's definitely in there. He's had no problem with encoding, but he might have a little bit of executive dysfunction. So his search strategy is going to be a little confounded, right? But here's where the possibilities and the hope comes in. If his wife just cues him, gives him a little hint and says, hey, I want a cake. Cake starts with a C. He can go right to that C file, open it up, pull out the memory, and bake the cake, okay? So go to the next slide, please. So this is really what's going on behind the scenes, is there's 2 main types of memory, or at least 2 main types for our conversation today. One is called free recall memory, and that's the ability to sort of bring things up unprompted from memory. And people with Alzheimer's have a lot of trouble with it. People with Parkinson's have a little bit of trouble. Now, recognition memory, the ability to recognize something that's in there, is still impaired in Alzheimer's, but usually normal or nearly normal in Parkinson's. And so what that means is, just like my example, someone with Parkinson's has the memory in there. So what I would encourage people to do is, if it takes a little more time, let them recall it on their own, or if they are struggling a little, just give them a hint. Say, yeah, you remember the time we were on vacation in the summer? And just give them little contextual cues, and I promise you it's there. And this really is the difference between encoding, putting new memories in, and then retrieval, the process of finding information to remember. So most of the time in Parkinson's, memory is fine, and you just might need a little help to get there. And so I think this is a message of hope, because people might begin to panic when things don't float to the surface immediately. And really all you need most of the time is a little hint and a little more time to bring that memory up. If there are more problems, like I said, it could indicate that something more is going on. So now let me show you some of what we call evidence-based treatments for cognitive issues in Parkinson's. And by evidence, I mean things that have been rigorously scientifically investigated and tested in Parkinson's. So this slide's a little tricky, and this isn't just for Parkinson's either. This is for all diseases that affect the brain, whether it's Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. We really don't have great evidence yet for mild changes, okay? I will tell you that for the first time in my career, we're actually testing things that look like they might work in the early stages, both in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And so for Parkinson's, things that have been under investigation for these mild changes are rivastigmine, which goes under the brand name Exelon. And again, it may help. It's just there isn't enough evidence. Maybe there isn't enough sort of what we call parametric space in the mild changes to tell whether or not it's helping. And we don't typically do long-term studies. So it might also be that we just didn't let the changes play out long enough to know if medications like rivastigmine are going to make a long time improvement, because we usually study maybe 6, 8, 10 weeks in these studies, and we might actually need to observe someone for 10, a year or more. And so again, right now there's insufficient evidence to conclude that they're efficacious. But some people try to start them early and they may or may not be helping. We just can't prove it. Another medication that's sort of investigational for early changes in Parkinson's is rasagiline, which goes under the brand name Azilect. And this is a medication that helps increase the amount of circulating monoamines in the brain. So instead of acetylcholine that rivastigmine's working on, this is working on monoamines. And we think that might be helpful. But again, when you only have mild deficits, we can't prove that it's better than placebo at this point. And it could just be the methodology of our current studies. Another intervention that might be helpful is transcranial direct current stimulation. So this is literally running current through the brain. And usually we're running it through the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. And again, the studies that have looked at this have mostly looked at whether or not this might improve executive dysfunction, which, as I mentioned, is one of the earliest and most common changes in Parkinson's. And so I think this could be another promising intervention for cognitive impairment in Parkinson's. And then this last one, cognitive rehabilitation, is already in use in people who've had strokes and traumatic brain injury, and is definitely shown to be efficacious there. And so I think for cognitive rehabilitation in Parkinson's, it'll really just be learning how to best apply it. So currently there's insufficient evidence, but I definitely think this is something that you'll be seeing soon. And then one other thing I want to mention that isn't on this slide is that at Johns Hopkins right now, I am leading a study in Alzheimer's that's looking at levetiracetam for early changes in people with Alzheimer's, and it's showing some promise. And so we're also piloting that in Parkinson's disease right now, and it's very interesting. And hopefully in future, talks here, I'll be able to update you on the findings there. Because again, remember, this is intervening at the early stage to slow down any furthering, worsening of the impairment. And so these really, go ahead and advance to the next slide, are the Holy Grail. Because if these treatments pan out, it might be that they're disease modifying. And by that, we mean slowing or halting the progression of this disease. And that's really what we want to do, because in a disease like this, when we talk about the progression and the symptoms sort of worsening or piling up, if at any point we can slow it down or stop it, all of a sudden we've got a different scenario, okay? And so that's where we're putting most of our effort at my institution, and I think increasingly many institutions are working toward disease-modifying treatment. So in the next slide here, I'm just going to talk about if you were to progress beyond these mild changes to the condition that we call dementia, which is, having more than one type of cognitive change and changes that you can't overcome by little tricks and workarounds. The good news is we have FDA-approved efficacious treatments for these conditions, okay? They help a little bit. They slow down further progression a little bit, and they might help a little bit with day-to-day function. And so the first three things on this list are all of the same class, more or less, called acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. And basically what they do is they increase the amount of acetylcholine in your brain by keeping a little more of it around. Okay, they stop you from breaking it down. And rivastigmine, that Exelon, is on this list as well. And here, for this indication, in the more severe form of cognitive impairment, it definitely has good evidence that it's helpful. A sister drug, donepezil, which is used most often in Alzheimer's, is also effective. Galantamine, again, a sister drug, all acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, help as well. Now, it says insufficient evidence, and that's just insufficient in Parkinson's. They've been shown efficacious in other diseases and probably are useful in Parkinson's as well. And so you have kind of a number of options, and that's the first intervention that I would use if you had a more severe impairment of cognition in Parkinson's. Usually these things are well tolerated and you don't need special monitoring, but they can cause nausea. And so that's probably the symptom that I tell people to watch out for most. Now, a sort of second intervention, so you're already maybe on the rivastigmine or the donepezil that you might use for memory impairment is memantine. It goes by the brand name Namenda. And again, this works by a different mechanism. It's a NMDA antagonist, and it probably works by decreasing overstimulation, or what we call glutamatergic hyperexcitation in the brain. And it's sort of our 1-2 punch. And again, it has insufficient evidence directly in Parkinson's, but it is FDA approved for these type of cognitive changes and other diseases. So, I just want to let you know that even if you do go to this more severe stage, we have effective FDA-approved treatments. So now let's talk a little bit about what you can do, okay? So what's in your doctor's arsenal if you come seeking help, but let me tell you now what you can do at home to function a little bit better. So again, and this is true whether you have Parkinson's or you don't. And nobody takes this advice because everybody, we're all in a hurry. We all want to do 10 things at once, but you really have to focus on one task at a time. And this is especially true with Parkinson's. You are going to be your most effective doing one thing at a time. And really, this is the message. I don't know if any of you meditate or practice mindfulness, but I've tuned into that, a couple of years ago now, and it really does make a difference. Whether it's, your work or your family, just being present and doing one thing at a time really helps you stop and smell the roses, for one thing, but it also helps you be efficient. Reduce distractions. I mean, again, this is another tenet of the mindfulness. It's really saying, hey, I'm here for you today, or I'm here for this action. It can be something as simple as washing your dishes. I'm just relaxing here. What I'm doing in this moment is getting the spaghetti sauce off this dish. And I know that, kind of sounds corny, but if you really start to bring that to your day-to-day, you're going to find that you enjoy things more, you feel more relaxed. And, frankly, whether you're writing a scientific paper, organizing your medications, or spending time with your daughter, it's going to be much easier to do, and you're going to be more connected. The other thing, and I'm going to talk about this next in this slide set, is depression is one of the mimics of cognitive changes. So I can't tell you how many times people come in and they're like, Doc, I'm losing it. I'm demented. I'm losing my mind. I can't remember anything. And that really what's happening is they're depressed. And depression can look like dementia sometimes. It can fool you. And then the good news is depression is completely treatable, completely reversible. And so that's one of the things that, when you come to me telling me, hey, I think I'm having some of these cognitive impairments you mentioned, the first thing I'm going to do is screen you for depression, because I can reverse depression and restore your cognitive function. This fourth item is a big one: exercise. All the tests that we've done of medications, all the things that have either successfully come through and become FDA approved or not, exercise is currently the only disease-modifying therapy for Parkinson's. So not only does it slow down disease progression in the physical symptoms, it helps with the mental function as well. Exercise, people say, what can I do for my cognition? Should I take ginkgo biloba? Should I take these supplements? Should I do brain games? What should I do? The truth is, right now, best evidence for your brain and your mental function and your cognitive function is exercise, physical exercise. So put that on your list if it isn't already there. Prioritize quality sleep. In fact, those three things right there, exercise, sleep, and diet, if I were to rank order the three most important health behaviors, there they are: exercise, sleep, and diet. And that's whether you have Parkinson's or not. Those are the three things that are most important for your overall mental and physical health and emotional health. Okay. Do some cognitive training and rehabilitation. Now, these are things that I think you're going to see more and more of. Okay. Cognitive training are things you do like exercise, sort of proactively, like physical exercise. It's the equivalent of mental exercise. And there's applications now for this. I really like the Evolve app. Rehabilitation is something you do after you notice a problem or change. Okay. Increase or maintain consistent social interaction. Social interaction is part of the emotional and intellectual exercise for your brain. And so right now with the COVID epidemic, this has become a real problem. I mean, people who are socially isolated, we've shown that they deteriorate emotionally and intellectually. So even during COVID, you need to find a way, whether it's through an in-person pod or virtually like we're doing today through Zoom or Skype, you need to stay in contact with people. Okay, so now I want to talk about mood.
Real quick, I want to do a quick poll just to see how many of our people on have experienced cognitive issues or any cognitive decline in the last year or so. Be curious to see that. It's a large number. We got about 80% that have said yes, they've experienced cognitive issues over the last year, and 11% no, nothing. So interesting. Great. Okay.
All right. So go ahead and I'll just dive right in here to mood. And the big one here is depression. So depression is more prevalent, more common in Parkinson's disease than it is in people who don't have Parkinson's. And part of this is those same brain changes that cause the movement disorder. They affect the main pleasure chemical, dopamine, but they also affect other monoamines like serotonin and norepinephrine that are important for maintaining the normal functioning of your emotions. So it's not just your ability to be happy, it's your ability to experience the normal range of emotion. And so depression is more than just sadness. I mean, most people with depression will say they're sad, or feel down, but not always. Sometimes people will just lose interest in the things they normally do. And so what you'll notice sometimes is that they're just not doing their hobbies or engaging in the activities that they normally would. Or they're doing them, but they're not getting as much pleasure. They feel sort of washed out, or as if everything is in black and white instead of full color. Another thing that we'll see, and we call this collection of symptoms neurovegetative symptoms, is things that affect the physical body. So even though this is an emotional disorder, it can affect your appetite, and people will actually lose weight because of this. Sleep can be disturbed, and there's two ways this can go. You usually, either people will have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, or they'll sleep too much. And usually the appetite and sleep will go in one direction together. So the classic type of depression will bring insomnia, trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, and reduced appetite together. Or in a sort of atypical or variant of depression, people will sleep too much and eat almost in binge fashion. Okay, so you want to look out for those patterns of changes. Psychomotor changes can happen. So this is beyond the changes in Parkinson's. So the bradykinesia that everybody with Parkinson's has. Depression can slow down your movement, and we call that psychomotor retardation. And probably, to me, one of the biggest differences between bradykinesia and the slowing that comes with depression is the slowing with depression will often affect speech. And so if I'm interacting with someone who's profoundly depressed, you'll ask a question, and then you can almost count 1,000, 2, 1,000. There's this delay, this speech latency between the response, the question and the response. So take a be mindful and aware of that in someone you suspect might be depressed. Decreased energy. This is hard to sort out in someone who has Parkinson's fatigue, because you don't know if the energy problem is coming from depression or the Parkinson's itself. Now, here's a symptom, worthlessness or inappropriate guilt, okay, or suicidal thoughts. Those are distinctly due to depression. That's not going to overlap with Parkinson's. If anyone's talking about feeling worthless or helpless or thinking of death or dying, that's something you definitely want to bring to the attention of doctors, okay? And then here's what I meant about the overlap between cognitive function and depression. One of the core features of a depressive disorder is poor concentration, inability to focus on things, or being indecisive, literally just not being able to decide, something simple like what you're going to have for lunch. Okay, next slide. So this is a really high impact symptom. So there's something right now that's an ongoing study called the Parkinson's Outcome Project, and it's a longitudinal study of health outcomes in Parkinson's. It's one of the biggest ongoing studies in Parkinson's ever. It's got tens of thousands of people in it right now. And they found that depression has almost twice the impact on quality of life as the motor symptoms of Parkinson's. So the symptoms that define Parkinson's are less important for quality of life, according to the study, than depression. So recognizing and treating depression is a key thing to do, okay, because it really affects your day-to-day life in Parkinson's. And this is a study that my group did on the longitudinal impact of depression on disability and Parkinson's, okay? So jump to the next slide and let me just show you the take home of this study. We have this longitudinal study of Parkinson's at Hopkins that I think is entering its almost 20th year now, where we've followed people with Parkinson's disease. And let me orient you really quickly to the slide. We use this disability scale called the Northwestern Disability Scale. Now, this is a scale that looks at things like walking, eating, hygiene. So very fundamental physical functions, okay? Lower scores are worse functioning, higher scores are better functioning. So you can see 50 is ideal functioning and 20 is bad physical functioning. The horizontal line there, 1, 2, 3, and 4, is time in our study, and each point represents 2 years in our longitudinal study. And so there's 3 lines there. They're a little hard to make out, but you can see that there's a green line that goes across all years of the study, and that's people who've never been depressed. And you can see that more or less they're functioning physically pretty well, right up there around the 40 mark of the Northwestern. And you can see that there is a little bit of decline. So that you can see over the kind of 6 to 8 years of the study segment that we're looking at, there's a little decline from the left to the right in people who've never been depressed. That's the Parkinson's decline. Now, what I want you to really pay attention to is that dashed right line, dashed blue line, sorry, and that dashed red line. So that dashed red line are people who are actively, or what we call symptomatically depressed, SD, okay? And you can see that they are functioning at a lower level physically, that's walking, eating, feeding, hygiene type things, speaking, than the people on the dashed blue line or green line, okay? And the dashed blue line are people who've had depression and then either spontaneously remitted or were treated into remission. So that's really important there. The message here is that being depressed makes you physically function worse than you should. But the good news is that at any point, if you treat or get relief from that depression, your phase shifted back to that normal line of functioning. Okay, so that's a hopeful message. But it makes it important to recognize and treat depression. So let me show you, go ahead. Let me show you the evidence-based treatments for depression and Parkinson's, okay? Now this is from the Movement Disorder Society guidance paper. And the point is that you can treat depression using a variety of antidepressants that are marketed and FDA approved. Okay, venlafaxine, the brand name is Effexor, is the one with the best evidence, okay? And it also helps with chronic pain. So for Parkinson's, it's a great option because many people with Parkinson's also have some physical discomfort or pain. And so this venlafaxine will help both with depression and with pain. The other medications are the tricyclic antidepressants and SSRIs. Now they have less evidence, but it might just be because of the design of the studies, okay? I can tell you that we use them all the time. Now, outside of oral medications, RTMS, which is a type of repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, and then electroconvulsive treatments can be used. These are sort of brain stimulation treatments. I won't talk a lot about them because they're not often used, because usually oral medications are sufficient. And then cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to help in Parkinson's, and that's a type of talk therapy that's very effective and widely available. Go ahead to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about anxiety too. So anxiety often is comorbid, co-occurring with depression and Parkinson's disease. And this is a sort of a persistent worry, or can even be panic, very severe, acute anxiety, worrying that the worst is going to happen. People will often be unable to relax when they're experiencing anxiety. They'll feel restless or even pace. They're so tense that to diffuse that tension and anxiety, they'll pace or move around, stand up, sit down. They can also have trouble concentrating or be indecisive. And that's why I thought it was important to talk about mood and anxiety along with cognition, because oftentimes if you treat the anxiety or depression, you really don't have as much of a cognitive problem as you thought. Trembling, so it can increase your tremor sometimes when you're anxious. Sometimes people will sweat excessively because of Parkinson's. Well, if you're anxious, you might sweat even more. And this can also affect your gastrointestinal symptom, and people will sometimes get loose stool, diarrhea, or butterflies or upset stomach when they're anxious. Go ahead to the next slide. Anxiety is maybe even a little more common than depression in Parkinson's. And at least half of people will have some clinically significant anxiety symptoms, and about a third will have a diagnosable anxiety disorder over the course of the Parkinson's disease. So here's one thing that I want to talk about, because I think this is something that if you're not aware of it, your doctor might miss it. Even good neurologists sometimes miss this association. So let me orient you to this slide really quickly. So that 0 time on the horizontal x-axis line, you can see it right in the middle of that orangish red peak, is the time of onset of Parkinson's disease. Everything to the left of that is before you're diagnosed with Parkinson's, and everything to the right of 0 is after you have Parkinson's. So when we started looking at anxiety and Parkinson's, one of the things we noticed is that many people with Parkinson's have anxiety before they're ever diagnosed with Parkinson's. And this has actually become something that we recognize as possibly an early feature of increased risk of Parkinson's. And that people who have anxiety earlier in life are actually at increased risk of Parkinson's later in life. And so we thought that was really interesting. But what was really important is that once you're diagnosed with Parkinson's, that sort of reddish orange peak, many people with Parkinson's begin to have anxiety in association with the fluctuation in response to their Parkinson's medication, these so-called on-off fluctuations. And that's something that we want to make people aware of, because if your anxiety is triggered by the up and down ebb and flow of your dopamine medications, that's something usually we can improve by changing your dopamine regimen. So go to the next slide and I'll sort of illustrate what I mean by this. Basically what happens, and we're getting better and better at this with new medications like Rytary, is you take a Parkinson's medication, classically it's Sinemet, and you absorb it into your gut, right? And your symptoms are alleviated, you turn on. Okay. And for a while, usually hours, you function well and you feel good emotionally and physically. But then at some point, you start to get to where that Sinemet dose wears off. And if you don't take another medication in time, you'll experience the return of your Parkinson's movement symptoms. And during that period, that off period, many people also experience mood and anxiety. okay? And this on-off anxiety is the one that if you're not paying attention to the timing, the association of the anxiety to the timing of your Parkinson's medication, it can be missed. And you might be thinking the anxiety is coming from somewhere else, okay? So go to the next slide. And I want to show you how certain we are that some anxiety in Parkinson's is associated with the ebb and flow of dopamine. So this is a study that was done by Miracle and Jay Nutt's group out in the Oregon health system. They basically gave infusions of levodopa, it's one of the components of your Cinemet. And they found that people who were really anxious, if you started an infusion of dopamine, they got more relaxed. Their anxiety went down. And then when you stopped that infusion, you can see once you get outside of that infusion bar, the anxiety returned. And basically these two lines just show the patient's experience of anxiety, but also their loved ones ranking their anxiety during the time of the infusion. And so very clearly this tells you that in some people with Parkinson's, not having enough dopamine can be part of the reason you're anxious. Now, go to the next slide. And I want to show you that that's also true of mood and depression. And it's tied to not only the dopamine infusion, so it's not just the dopamine level, it's how well you're moving. And so this is the opposite valence of the slide I just showed you. But basically, you can see that people who are unmedicated report a low mood, okay? And they're moving very slowly. So maybe they're tapping their fingers and it's small and it's slow. Then you start to infuse the levodopa, which is the dopamine. And you can see that both their reported mood improves, but also their finger tapping improves and speeds up, okay? And then you cut off the infusion and their mood gets worse. They feel crummy and they're moving slowly. So this is a really important association between the motor symptoms and the dopamine in Parkinson's and the mood and anxiety. And this is something that is important because in people who don't have Parkinson's, we really don't worry about replacing dopamine or the dopamine system at all. But in Parkinson's, we think it's really important. So we kind of have a 1-2 punch. We're going to use the same anxiety and depression medications that we use in the non-Parkinson's population to help you, but we may also need to make adjustments to your Parkinson's medications to really target your mood and anxiety. So go ahead to the next slide. And here you can see that the treatment of anxiety is really optimizing motor function and addressing any motor fluctuations, okay? We really don't have great PD-specific medications yet, but they're under study. Here's that cognitive behavioral therapy again that we recommend. Mindfulness. I think you're going to hear more and more about this because mindfulness does everything pretty much that cognitive behavioral therapy does, except for guess what? You carry it with you for life. Once you learn mindfulness and meditation, it's a skill that if you practice, follows you forward, okay? And then as I mentioned, neuromodulation is an emerging option that I won't talk about too much today, but I think you're going to hear more and more about that. And go to the next slide because I want to get to what you can do, okay? And this is really important. Here it is again. And Davis mentioned this right at the very beginning of the day. Stay connected. I like to say that social isolation is the equivalent of smoking for mental health. Okay, it's bad for you. It's both got short and long-term consequences. You need to stay engaged. You need to participate in structured activities. That's the exercise of the mind. Okay, whether it's hobbies or being social, going out with lunch with other people. Here's exercise again. Physical activity has been shown to benefit mental health, okay, by lifting mood and easing tension. And then sleep well, okay? You need to really have a good bedtime routine so that you get your adequate amount of sleep. And it's both a risk factor for depression and anxiety and a symptom. So it's one of those things that if you can break the cycle and sleep well, you're going to improve yourself overall.